Hello and welcome to our video submission for quiz number 2. Maddie and I will be discussing the intersections or implications of a nation at risk on Obama's educational policies during his 2 terms in office. We'll first start with a brief overview of a nation at risk, the purpose and findings, as well as the general state of the 20th century urban education system, before going into a review of Obama's key educational policies, including his Race to the Top initiative and his Every Student Succeeds Act. Then we will go into a synthesis of these 2 ideas or documents just to see where the overlap is and the current consequences or further findings that we might be able to address or consider moving forward as educators. So we're going to start off with the overview of a nation at risk with Maddie Set.
Hey, hello. So right before I dive deep into the nation at risk, I think it's worth to note what the state of education was looking like during the 20th century. And so, as we know, this was a massive time of growth and challenges and transformation in terms of what we teach and how students were learning at that time. So one of the most notable things that were happening during this time was the progressive era. And essentially, during this time, there was an effort to make public education more accessible and more universal. So there was a special emphasis on bringing more people into the education system and quote unquote making it more accessible. And all of this was in efforts to prepare students to become, prosperous citizens of the United States. However, things did take a turn in the middle of the 1900s, around the 1930s, when we saw the Great Depression kind of take over, and schools, unfortunately, were hit through budget cuts. A lot of schools were shut down, teachers were laid off, and there was now this new problem about how are we going to fund these schools and how are we going to make sure that these schools have the resources needed in order to continue our war on education. However, that wasn't the only thing that we were considering during this time point, as veterans were returning back home. And then we see things like the GI Bill, the Brown v. Board of Education, and those attempts, not only to disintegrate the segregations that were very prevalent in our school system, but also to integrate veterans. And so while all of this was happening, urban schools in particular, I think were facing more unique challenges, as they were the schools that were specifically underfunded and were overcrowded. And so during this time, as all these factors are into play, it kind of segues into the report A Nation at Risk, as now that all of these factors are at play, what is happening in these schools? What are we doing to address the issues in the education system? So in 1983, the U.S. Department of Education commissioned this report so that the report could provide us with what the state of education was like during this time period, as well as to provide recommendations to address the deficiencies that were spoken throughout this report. I would say overall there was a certain call to awareness, as the report did highlight very specific deficiencies in our education system. These educational deficiencies also highlighted the fact that the United States was falling behind to other its counterparts, in regards to the strides that were being made in the educational achievement. So essentially, that just means students were significantly underperforming in core subjects like math, science, and reading. Some of these findings were there were low test scores, there was low achievements among schools and among students, and one of the biggest things that I would like to give attention to is that low literacy rates weren't just something specific to a state, it was a nation crisis. And so there's a very popular and alarming quote in this report, which basically described this time period as a rise tide of mediocrity, which wasn't just affecting education or the educational system, it was affecting the nation as a whole. Because if we don't have education and giving these students a strong backbone, then how are we then able to have a prosperous society and have citizens who are going to contribute to the nation. Um, and it's also important to note that while it did have these findings, it also did provide us with the causes. One of the causes was that curriculum during this time wasn't rigorous enough. And specifically in urban schools, there was the concept that expectations were low for students, that they were having to be lowered due to the fact that, students in these schools were facing much more than what was happening in the classroom. And so that also led to a concern that maybe even instructional time wasn't being used effectively. And so moving forward, this report did offer the nation with reforms to education and improvements we could make. And I would like to note that these improvements are in sectors that we aren't, to our surprise, as to this day, we are still attempting to meet the needs of our students through these recommendations, which were a more rigorous curriculum, which we now continue seeing and hearing about. We have seen several states change their curriculum to make it more rigorous. And we have also heard from teachers and their kind of their experience with adopting a more rigorous curriculum. There has also been a call for higher quality instruction and higher quality and being able to retain and hire high quality teachers. And so with those recommendations in mind, there have been several attempts to meet these needs, not just in the 20th century, but moving forward in the 21st century, which, that brings us forth to the efforts that have been made throughout several presidential terms, but we would like to specifically focus on the residual effects of this report and how Obama dealt with the education crisis during his term.
So it's clear from Mariset's overview of 20th century American education that 21st century presidents inherited an educational system that was really coming to terms with its own inadequacies. And those anxieties are no clearer than the educational law that Obama inherited from President Bush, which was the No Child Left Behind Act, which was institutionalized in 2002. No Child Left Behind really focused on standardized testing as a metric for student success and school performance, really to the detriment of understanding and having a comprehensive view of a school's performance and ability to teach students. As such, in Obama's second term in 2015, he was able to successfully pass the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was a direct repudiation of the No Child Left Behind Act of 2002. So Every Student Succeeds Act wanted to put less emphasis on standardized testing. It still recognized student data as one of the more tangible ways to understand student success. However, it no longer placed the federal government as the sole arbiter of a school's ability to teach students. So it really gave a little bit more leeway and released a lot of campuses from the unrealistic expectations outlined by the No Child Left Behind Act. And these expectations from Bush's act were directly harmful to low-income Title I schools that were made up of majority Black and Brown students. So the Every Student Succeed Act really tried to release some of that pressure. Right when Obama entered office, so 2009 to 2010, the Common Core state standards were also developed and released by the Department of Education. While Obama did not personally author these standards, he was a direct champion of these standards, which basically meant that he sort of developed the Race to the Top initiative, which was a funding or financial incentive for states to adopt the standards. So if a state did adopt the Common Core as well as the assessments that went along with it, they received direct federal funding from the government, and that was served to encourage states to adopt this curriculum. This was incredibly successful. Within the first year of being released, over 40 states adopted the Common Core state standards in order to obtain that funding. The Common Core state standards were developed empirically, so they were supported by research, they were supported by people or professionals in the educational field in order to develop a more rigorous curriculum that would address some of the deficiencies and inequities that were currently at play in the American education system that were directly sort of lingering from the impacts of the 20th century. So the Common Core state standards were really sort of the bread and butter of Obama's educational goals and policies, and directly impacted the way that he thought about curriculum and how the rigorous standards should be set in order to achieve a higher student performance overall following his term as president. So this directly leads us into our synthesis of how these policies sort of intersect and reflect the impact that the nation at risk had on the American education system and our current understanding of those inefficiencies. We're going to start by really first addressing the NAEP data that came about directly following President Obama's term and the inauguration of the Every Student Succeeds Act. So the report's findings, which really sort of assess student performance and growth over time, did show a slight improvement in reading and math scores for 4th and 8th grade students. However, these improvements were fairly marginal. Reading students specifically at the 4th and 8th grade levels really only saw a 3-point improvement prior to the previous report, which really is not that significant. Math scores, however, did see a 10-point improvement, which is, a pretty significant increase. But this is mainly attributed to Obama's emphasis on STEM in education, where he really wanted to prioritize science, technology, engineering, and math within the American school system. So it really goes to show that his emphasis on that learning in education, and obviously this was reflected in the Common Core state standards, really did have a direct impact on student scores and learning. Alongside this tangible data that shows that even with all of these legislative efforts to improve the education system, the improvements were not too significant, is the note that the achievement gap along racial lines was still present based on the findings of the NAEP. So while this gap did shrink following Obama's presidential term, it was still very much present. So Marisa wants to add on a little bit to our synthesis as well.
Yes, so it is worth noting that he did address the same issues in the education system that were present back in the 20th century. These ongoing issues echoed throughout the decades and there were fair attempts to be resolved through educational policies and based on, the policies that specifically Obama put into place. And the results which were outlined by Jess. One can argue that Obama did have and make concerted efforts to resolve the issues that were going on in education. And so going back to the NAEP data, which is the nation's report card that shows the performance of our students, although, as Jess said, there were improvements, there is still disparities when it comes to socioeconomic and racial lines. So this does align with the low literacy rates that were found amongst minorities back in the 20th century, as well as the underperformances brought forth by the report, A Nation at Risk. And so just kind of to tie this in together and to, end it with the concerns that we still face and that linger in the back of our minds as educators and through our own experiences. If we take into consideration that a lot of these issues were presented back 20 plus years ago, that were attempted to be addressed throughout several decades amongst presidents, and now looking at our real life experience and having tangible evidence of the work that we do as educators, for me, there is a personal remaining concern, what will it take for this to change? And it also makes me question how effective are these policies truly if we are continuing to see the same results within the same groups of people. We are continuously seeing socioeconomic statuses in play. We are continuing to see racial lines being blurred. And when I say blurred, I mean in the sense of there isn't anything being done to address the underperformance of Black and Brown students. So as educators, what is there for us to do? It makes me wonder how much can we really do when the legislation, the political atmosphere and environment at play isn't to our advantage. And it is worth noting that it's going to take more than one person to truly enact change within the educational system and to, in a sense, dismantle this educational inequity that we have been facing for several decades in our country. now that we have the knowledge, it makes me think, what is there left for us to do? What is there that we can do? And, would also like to offer Jess's perspective.
Yeah, so to finish that off, this sort of case study of Obama's educational policies alongside a nation report really serves as a sort of microcosm of the larger issues at play, which is this difficult and often elliptical relationship between legislation and education, which are essentially almost two sides of the same coin, in which one directly impacts and benefits off of the other. The current political and economic landscape directly sort of gains power and traction from an education system that indoctrinates certain economic and racial classes and sort of denigrates them to specific places in the economic and cultural landscape of the United States. So this ideology directly pervades the educational system. And so despite efforts from certain individuals like President Obama right here to resolve those inequities, it really is a deeper systemic and ideological issue that is not able to be addressed or cured at just a simple legislative change. So until we are able to kind of purge the bones of white supremacy from the educational system and really sort of address the sort of root cause of these inequities, then these legislative or political efforts to reduce or correct educational deficiencies will never actually come to fruition. These educational deficiencies are almost directly and purposefully planted inside the educational system because it directly regenerates a racist and capitalist society that profits off of the issues and the problems in education. We've frequently talked about the sort of disparities in, a Title I school curriculum versus either a private school or a majority white school, which is that students in Black and brown schools are taught obedience, they are taught memorization, they are taught to follow the rules. And, this then takes us into the narrative of the school to prison pipeline, whereas white students in higher income areas are taught to critically think, they are taught to question, and they are taught leadership skills. So we'll see that the very blueprint of the educational system, despite efforts to allow every student to succeed, really is putting a Band-Aid on a deeper bleeding wound that requires far more care. So with that really positive and optimistic note about the future of the educational system, we are going to wrap this up. We may not be able to get both of us in the frame, but we appreciate you for watching. Thank you so much. And